Today's lesson is on using resource materials. There are two main types of resources, primary resources and secondary resources, or we sometimes just call them sources. Primary sources are first-hand accounts or somebody that has actually witnessed it, whereas secondary sources are based off of other sources. So often they're based off of primary sources or they are off of other secondary sources. So primary sources can include interviews. So if you were to interview someone that lived through an actual experience, that would be a primary source. Say if you were learning about one of the wars and you met someone that actually lived through it, that would be a first-hand account. They would be considered a primary source. Now, diaries that are kept by people in these situations can also be considered a primary source, like Anne Frank's diary. She wrote exactly what was happening, so that's a first-hand account. And that's why I've been telling you guys that you can be creating your own primary sources right now for this whole pandemic, right? Anything that you were to keep or track would be considered a primary source. Experiments would also be considered a primary source if you are doing the experiment yourself or you're seeing someone do the experiment. So the questions here, they're going to get you to research the circulatory system. A primary resource for that could be you doing an experiment on your heart rate. You would be getting first-hand information about how your heart works. Primary sources also include observations that you make yourself. So anything that you are first-hand able to witness and observe and keep track of would be considered a primary source. They give you quite an extensive list of secondary sources in your book, but I'm just going to go over the ones that we still tend to use. So the first one is encyclopedias, and we usually have the encyclopedia cart in our classroom. That is a secondary source because the encyclopedia isn't an eyewitness account, but it's a compilation of research that the writers have done based on other people's primary or secondary sources, and the work you would create from that research would be considered a secondary source. Specialized reference books would be books that are geared towards a specific topic. They would have to be nonfiction, right? All the information is true. So kind of like the books that I had in the class about Egypt when we were doing our Egypt project. Or I know Mr. O, when you did body systems, he had a lot of books from the library that were specifically about that body system. Those would be specialized reference books. Now, computer databases are a little bit different than they used to be, and you won't have as much exposure to them, but especially in university, every university will have an online library database catalog that will give lots of information and help you keep track of all of the different kind of periodicals and things. This isn't one that you would have a ton of access to right now in elementary school. In a lot of university libraries, there's also a section on kind of like videos and films. Well, they'll have videos and films that will present the information. So your modern day version of that is YouTube, but you need to make sure that you'd have trusted kind of sources on that or documentaries. As long as they're trusted sources, they would be considered secondary sources. Periodicals and journals are academic kind of magazines or combinations of work. You'll use them a lot more in university, where there will be maybe a periodical or a journal specifically on computer science, and they will release 4 issues a year, and everything inside there is written on that subject, and it's usually the latest research that academic people such as professors or researchers are putting together and submitting to these periodicals and journals, and they're being peer-reviewed, so they're authenticated. Dictionaries and thesauruses, or thesauri, are also considered secondary sources, so this will help to give you the meaning of words or synonyms of words in the case of a thesaurus. They could also help to give you some of the history of the words too. Atlases are secondary sources that help you to see where, like maps and geography of where things are located or information about the elevation or the terrain of different areas. So their inclusion of CD-ROMs is just showing you that not everything has to be a hard copy to be a source. So you could have in their computer databases, like Google would provide you with lots of secondary sources. You could have a CD of information if you were storing it in a different way. We would now more have like thumb drives of information. Sometimes information is presented in charts and posters so that they're easier to read, but they are still valid sources if their information is accurate. Nonfiction books are another secondary source. So remember, fiction is false or made up. Nonfiction are true. So they would have accurate information. From your houses, it might be hard to find access to secondary sources or sources at all that are not based on the internet, because we can't go to the library right now to go and check out books. So you can access most of these on the internet. When you are doing searches through Google, they are giving you secondary sources. Now, if you are researching something, your biggest goal is to make sure that the sources you're using are valid, which means that the information they're giving you is accurate. So we know that you can change things on the internet, right? That's why people say not to use Wikipedia, even though it usually gets updated fairly frequently. But that's one of the things we have to be a little bit more mindful of with the internet, is they haven't necessarily been vetted the same way. As we already talked about with our Egypt project, one of the things to be careful of when you're using resources is actually giving credit where credit is due. So this can be done in a reference list. And we've already done examples of this, but they've quickly given you a list of information that you could be jotting down about each resource that you use. So for books, the information that you usually need to include is the author's name, the title of the work, the city of publication, so the city where it was published, the publisher itself, and the date of publication. Most bibliographies, no matter which format you're using, include these 5 basic elements. For internet sources, you only need to jot down the URL or the address in the address bar and the date that you access the website, and that should be enough information to go back later and fill out a bibliography if you need to. For your lesson today, they're going to ask you to do some research on the circulatory system. So for the first question, they ask you to list 1 primary and 3 secondary resources. So primary sources could be, remember, they're interviews, experiments, or observations. So if you were to interview a cardiothoracic surgeon, they don't have time right now because we're in the middle of a pandemic, but if we weren't and you knew one, that could be an option. Or maybe you know someone in your family that is a doctor or a nurse and they know about the circulatory system. Could also be if you did an experiment. So say you were checking your pulse and then you ran on the spot to see if your pulse increased and how that's affected by things. That would be a primary source. Secondary resources could include encyclopedias. You can use Britannica Kids, or you could technically use Wikipedia. It just might not be as trusted. You could find 3 websites that you could use if you don't have any encyclopedias or physical books in your house. For the second question, they're going to ask you to go to one of the secondary sources that you chose. You don't need to go to all of them, just one, and summarize the information that you learned in 1 paragraph. I would ask you to find at least 3 to 5 details or facts minimum. Once you've gone through your 1 source, you're going to do an internet search for circulatory system, and you're going to keep searching until you can find 2 extra pieces of information that you did not get from your original source. When you're finished, please upload a photo of page 95 to FreshGrade once you have finished answering those 3 questions, and that will be in place of your comment today.